Hi, and welcome to the GRIT podcast, Growing Resilience Informed on Trauma. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. First, we're going to take a look at the original ACE study, the research that was conducted there, as well as the findings. Then we're going to talk about how common ACEs are, as well as how they impact brain development. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at ACEs in the classroom. Thank you guys for joining. I'm Jamie Matthews. Let's jump in. So the original ACE study was funded by Kaiser Permanente, and ACEs were divided up into three different categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Now there's loads of resources online where you can do your own deep dive on ACEs, but basically what it shakes out to is that they discovered a 10-item and they used this list as a rating scale to assess how many adversities that a person would have. And so the original study was about 16,000 white males. And what they found of that population, which I would consider to be a privileged population, that they had 64% of them had at least one ACE or adverse experience in childhood. So from there, it can be determined that other populations, that would generalize to other populations. They did also find that women, especially women of color, are at risk for more adversity and more of these ACEs. Now, on a 10-item scale, the indicator that shows the most risk or having a higher risk for outcomes such as cancer, heart disease, unhealthy coping such as drug and alcohol use and abuse was 4. 4 was the number that said, we might start to see some things. We might start to see some health decreasing and negative outcomes in mental and emotional well-being, as well as successful outcomes in life. Also, they found that 6 or more ACEs could actually shave up to 20 years off of one's life. Next, we talked about how common they are, right? So 70% of people, approximately, have one, statistically based off of this research. But the interesting thing is that if you have one ACE, you're 88% more likely to have more than one. So that means that ACEs are compounding. Now, if you take into account poverty itself is considered to be an ACE. If you look at, say, your population in your classroom, if you take a look at your classroom full of students, the high risk score for a child is 3. Consider that there is a separation by divorce in the child's life. Consider that there is a parent with depression and possibly some birth trauma. Okay, so there's your 3 right there. The thing that I'm trying to get across here is that ACEs are more common than we think. And some of the things that we consider just to be normal happenings, which they are, can also significantly change health and well-being outcomes across a lifetime. And that's what that original ACE study really points to. I encourage you to take a look. The CDC has a lot of great resources for ACEs, and I'll try to find you guys a link and post in the show notes. So we're going to move on now to trauma and brain development. So Dr. Bruce Perry has some great research. He's got actually some brain scans that I refer to often in my trainings that show that the toxic stress from ACEs, or that chronic stress on brain development, can actually hardwire students, children, into that fight or flight mode. So what that means is that the survival regions of the brain, when a child is repeatedly exposed to high stress situations, whether it be abuse, neglect, such as not having its basic needs met. I want to pause right here and say attachment, which I could talk for days and days about attachment, but attachment basically is whenever the basic needs are met when the child is too young to care for him or herself. And that creates that healthy, trusting relationship between the caregiver and the child. So healthy attachment means that if a baby cries, the caregiver comes, okay? But oftentimes in cases of neglect or in abusive homes, that's just not the case. And not only are the basic needs not met, but often their health and safety is actually put at risk by the caregiver. And that can really be conflicting. And it can also change the brain and release extra cortisol, that stress hormone, into that developing brain. And Harvard has a great series on the brain, the developing brain, and toxic stress. And I encourage you to go check it out. Brain scans of these 3-year-olds, going back to Dr. Bruce Perry's research, show that a 50th percentile average 3-year-old brain compared to a high ACE number child having 3 or more, the brain scans are drastically different. The average 50th percentile brain, normal in size, normal in gray matter, and then you can also see that the child that had ACEs is actually very similar in composition and decreased gray matter, much smaller as that of a 65-year-old dementia patient. The changes in the brain are legitimate. They are researched and proven due to this toxic stress and the release of all these stress hormones. And that impacts development. That impacts how a child is going to attend. It impacts how a child is going to process verbal directions. It impacts how a child's going to regulate his or her emotions. It even changes how the body reacts whenever the child is too hungry or too thirsty or too tired. Because those same fight or flight pathways that we talked about earlier, those are the parts of the brain that are getting the most use when there's that much adversity in early childhood. And so for those reasons, the simple daily stresses of life, such as being overtired or a sudden change in routine, the small things seem to really trigger these children from hard places due to the changes in the brain. The emotional age of the child may actually be around half of the chronological age of that child. Do we know which brain we're dealing with? I often ask teachers, how do you know? We can't. We don't have brain scans of all our students, at least we don't in our school district. And if we were, I'm sure that they would show these changes in the brain, but we can't know. So what we have to gauge by is the children's behavior. And you can have an 8-year-old that is academically pretty much where they need to be, B's and C's. And whenever there is an outside stressor, say somebody kicks their shoe walking down the hall, or they're really stressing over, say, a math problem, they're quicker to get pushed over into that fight or flight. They are likely to have behaviors that aren't proportionate to the situation. And those are the kids that get labeled. Those are the kids that teachers say, oh, he just doesn't want to learn. Or his parents, they just need to teach him a lesson, right? But the reality is that those emotional outbursts aren't going to be chronologically age appropriate due to the potential changes in the brain. That 8-year-old child, when put under extreme stress, is actually going to react more like a 4-year-old. And in turn, that is how you have to relate to that child. More on that in the podcast to come. But for now, we're going to just take a little turn here and talk about what do ACEs look like in the classroom. So students with 3 or more ACEs are 300% more likely to fail a grade. They're 6 times more likely to have behavior concerns stemming from those unmet needs. Remember, we talked about how early on in utero even there is so much stress causing these changes in the brain, and it comes from these unmet needs. The need for feeling safe, the need for protection and buffering from the stresses of the outside world. And often, those behavior concerns are actually like they're check engine lights that say, I have a need for safety that is not being met. Also, kids from hard places are going to score lower on standardized tests. They're 5 times more likely to have severe attendance problems, and they also typically have a higher designation to SPED. I want to pause right here. As a school counselor, I sat in on many IEP meetings. Okay, all the teachers are like, I don't want to even talk about IEPs, right? So IEP stands for Individual Education Plan. And IEP planning can be hard because you're trying to basically get the parent, the teachers, the admin, everybody, all the team, if there are any special support specialists like speech, you're trying to get everybody on the same page. And often that child will have had a psychological evaluation in order to determine what is the best plan to intervene on this child's behalf or to really meet their educational needs within the classroom. Often students with an IEP have a classification of special education and they are pulled out of the gen ed classroom. Now, sometimes on an IEP there will be a diagnosis, such as ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Sometimes it'll say ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, and we slap labels on these kids, right? Because like I said, we're having behaviors. Often kids from hard places are having behaviors in the classroom, and the teachers are like, get this kid out of here, right? Which is understandable. But sometimes in those IEP meetings, you'll see a diagnosis come across that says OHI. And OHI stands for Other Health Impairment. Now, no disrespect to school psychologists because they work very hard and they have put in a lot of hours of training and they have the background to assess and diagnose. I too have had diagnosis and assessment as part of my school counseling degree, but dare I say that if we're not taking into account the child's history and the trauma history, that we're not going to really be nailing it with the diagnosis. Because OHI simply means this child isn't behaving well in class. I don't have the data I need to slap an ADHD diagnosis or an ODD diagnosis, but I have to write something on this paper so that this child will be moved from gen ed to special ed and get out of the gen ed teacher's hair. Overall, the worldview and the behaviors of these students is going to be significantly different. My suggestion is that we try to address the basic needs for sensory, for blood sugar, for hydration, for feeling safe, through routines, through structure, through good communication, and move from punitive punishments to more restorative modes of practice. Because if we move from a place of looking at outcomes alone to meeting the basic needs of the child, it's been researched to show that those behaviors, those unwanted behaviors of outbursts and yelling and fighting, they go down. So let's consider that maybe this child just isn't inherently flawed, and maybe this child isn't being willfully disobedient. Maybe this child who's having these behaviors comes from a hard place and has learned some pretty unique survival skills based off of that brain development, where the lower regions of fear they're heightened. Those neural pathways are stronger as a result of having to protect him or herself or fend for him or herself whenever it was not developmentally appropriate to do. These children's brains are different, and research does show that whenever you implement compassionate practices, you meet those basic needs, those unwanted behaviors, they decrease. Now, a caveat here. We can't expect educators to implement all of these to implement fully trauma-informed best practice if we are not also meeting our educators with that same unconditional positive regard. We must, as school districts, and really as states in our nation, have to consider that educators too have a trauma history and that they too must be handled with compassion and met with connection and felt safety. Let's not be naive and just say, it's their job. Let these educators do one more thing, one more program, one more thing to check off the list. Okay, that's not fair and it's cruel. They've already come through COVID. Give teachers the same respect that you expect them to show the students when implementing trauma-informed best practices. Going back to the kids and the behaviors in the classroom, these behaviors not only come from a place of survival, but they also come from a place of basic mistrust. If you think about it, if the people who God entrusted you to keep you safe and healthy are not doing that so well, and also might be contributing to your pain, to your discomfort, to your lack of safety, if they're in fact abusing you, you're going to have a very view on the world. You're not going to trust people. So when they come to school, they're often going to be mistrusting, fearful, and anxious. And because of that, you're also going to see some more behaviors, such as trying to seek control, trying to feel safe through controlling the situation around them. They're going to try to get that control in unhealthy ways. We have to just run it through a filter. Is this child truly willfully disobedient, or is it a survival strategy? And I bet if you really got to know that student, if you really considered the history, you would begin to identify patterns. You would be able to see that at this certain time of day, let's say before lunch, for example, this child starts to act overly aggressive and is really easily triggered. But then you notice that after lunch, this child is more calmed down to baseline. You can guarantee that child's probably hungry, okay? And hunger doesn't do the same thing in a child with ACEs as without ACEs, okay? Hunger and dehydration, low blood sugar specifically, not just hunger, but is going to trigger that fight or flight. Okay, so if you look at the history, if you step back and you look at the whole day of that child that may be causing you grief, you'll be able to pinpoint the patterns. Now, I'm not saying the ADHD isn't real, and I'm not saying that other diagnoses aren't appropriate, but there is a significant overlap between ADHD presentation and a child who is scanning for safety or either stimming and fidgeting, trying to self-soothe. And they look the same. It looks the same. In the classroom, there was a study done, and they were checking to see whether kids with high ACE scores, which would be 3 or more for children, and kids without high ACE scores, how they would perform in the classroom setting. They presented a lesson, and they quizzed on the content. As you would imagine, the kids with high ACE scores did not perform well on the quiz. The kids who had low ACE scores or no ACEs, they did great. No surprise there. But one thing that was surprising is that they actually did another assessment, and that was on the children's perception of their environment. And the surprising results for that were that the kids from hard places aced that part of the assessment. They were able to tell you how many people walked by the door, whether they were male or female, what they were wearing. They could tell you who cheated on the quiz. They could tell you who all dropped their pencil, because they were scanning the environment. Why? For safety. They were scanning their environment for safety. Now, the kids who didn't have high ACEs, those kids, they couldn't tell you anything about their environment. Those kids had the privilege to attend to the lesson because they are not used to having to scan for safety within their own home. Now, is this always the case? No, but this is the case, as we know, 30% being that high risk number. 30% of your students, 30% of kids are going to have a significant number of ACEs. Dare I say more following COVID? Let's be honest. If you had one ACE going into COVID, you for sure got 2 now, okay? And like I said, they compound. So what's the answer? I believe trauma-informed schools is a really good start. And Pam Leo said it best. She said, either we spend the time meeting children's basic needs by filling their cups with love, or we spend the time dealing with the behaviors from the unmet needs. Either way, we spend the time. What is the definition of a compassionate school? A compassionate school educates staff on how experiencing traumatic events, also known as ACEs, impact students' abilities to effectively learn. Through trainings and resource materials, educators learn how trauma impacts the brain development, the importance of relationships and connections with students, and strategies to foster resilience. These practices are not only interventions, but they're also preventive in nature, meaning that these practices benefit students from all backgrounds. Either way, we're going to spend the time. Let's put the time and energy on the front end so that we can see students really moving from surviving to thriving. Let's empower educators with safety, that they can be seen and heard, and that they can have mental health days off, and that they can have a calm down space in their lounge or whatever that may look like. Give them their planning periods. Have a Wellness Wednesday. Let's support educators so that they can, out of the overflow of their healing, of their healthy coping, of their peace, down to the kids. Because if you've worked within any system, that the energy of the top trickles down to the bottom. And schools with a lot of high-risk students, they have high turnover. It's been proven time and time again because it's hard. It's hard work to come in with unconditional positive regard and compassion day in and day out for those same kids who it feels like are acting out willfully, disobedient every day. But the reality is the brains have been changed, and we just really don't know. We don't know the depth and the breadth of the changes in the brain that each child may have had. Now, trauma-informed schools and compassionate schools that implement these policies and practices, it doesn't mean that you get a free pass for behavior. It means that behavior is dealt with very intentionally, but only after giving children the space and the place to learn the expected behavior, to try it again, and to be rewarded and praised whenever they get it right. Because the odds are, if you make space, hey, try that again with respect. Or if you make a joke out of it, whatever it may be, you can make it fun. You can make it engaging. But bring a level of play, bring a level of space and grace to have what is known as a redo. Give them a redo. Because if you don't share some power and some control, they're going to take it. And so yes, behavior has to be dealt with, but once the connection is established, once the safety of your classroom is established, that you can walk in a healthy, supportive role for students, you're going to see the change. Those behavior incidents are going to go down. They're going to stop taking control because they're going to feel like they have some, because you're going to give them space to say how they feel. You're going to give them tools to cope in healthy ways through sensory resources or mindfulness or whatever that may be. If you're interested in learning more about how you can move your school from surviving to thriving, please follow along with this podcast. Also, you can find us on all of the socials at Overcoming Adversity LLC. Please reach out. I'm also going to be giving away a free download for an advocacy handout that I created, and there is even some pertinent legislation in there to support these trauma-informed policies and practice. That's the overview of ACEs. That is why I won't stop talking about them, and that's what all the fuss about ACEs is. Just so you know, it doesn't stop here. There are tools for resilience, and research shows that there is hope and there is healing on the other side of these compassionate practices. Remember, you can be a light in the darkness. Blessings.